I set up a prank where my ex surprised us at dinner. His silence afterward broke me completely. Everything was going so well until I got the idea for a stupid prank. I wish I'd never thought of it in the first place and just left it at the dinner. Then I would still have my life. I would still have my relationship instead of this awful silence. George, male 31, and I, Dana, female 29, had been together for about 4 years before it happened. We met after I'd gone as my sister's +1 to a Christmas party at her job. He's a software engineer, one of the best in the company, and she'd introduced us not thinking anything of it, not thinking we would speak to each other, much less like each other. But then we found each other again outside the party. I'd gone out because the music had gotten too loud, and I still don't know why he was outside to this day. Come to think of it now, he never told me, and I never asked. We spent the rest of the night talking about anything and everything. We knew next to nothing about each other, but it somehow felt like we'd known each other our whole lives. There was just this weird instant connection. I'm an author, so I told him about a few books that I'd written and news stories that I was working on, and he spoke to me a bit about coding and computers. I couldn't understand a word of any of it, but in the end it didn't matter. We were already kind of smitten with each other. I was very wary at first about getting into a relationship with him because I'd just gotten out of a very long-term relationship with my ex-boyfriend Michael. Michael and I dated all throughout high school and on and off in college and afterwards. We were each other's first loves, and I think because of that we kept coming back to each other. Being with Michael was easy and familiar. It felt like no one knew me or understood me as well as he did. We got together when we were barely teenagers. His mom moved into the house next to my parents, and after they all became friends, we were forced to spend time with each other all the time. At first it was awful. I didn't want to be the girl stuck with the new kid in town because her parents made her, but eventually being around each other didn't feel so forced. We went to school together and came back together. We spent weekends and vacations together. Dating seemed like the next logical step after we'd gotten so close. Our relationship was steady and strong throughout those 4 years, but then we graduated and we had to go to college. He had a lot of options in big cities lined up for him because he was a football player and had already been eyed by different college scouts, while I'd just always planned to go to the community college in our town. I'd never had the best grades, and I already knew, even then, that being an author was what I was meant to do. We agreed to stay together even after he moved away, but the distance got to us eventually. I always felt like I was keeping him from experiencing new things, and he felt like his busy training/game schedule caused him to neglect me. It did, but I tried to be understanding of it. Eventually, we decided to break up. It was a hard decision, but we felt like it was what was right for us at the time. But even though we weren't together anymore, whenever it was the holidays and he came back to town, we just naturally fell into step again. It was like we'd never broken up and he'd never moved away in the first place. Our on and off relationship continued all throughout college and a few years after. It wasn't until he started to develop feelings for this girl that he'd met online that we really put an end to our relationship. It hurt even worse then because it felt final, like we were separating for good. I was still reeling from the official breakup with Michael when I met George. He was different from Michael, nerdy and soft-spoken where Michael was loud and overconfident, but it was kind of a breath of fresh air after being with one person for so long. He makes me laugh, and he knows way too much about all these random things, which comes in handy for when I need to create new characters with different quirks for my stories. Like I said before, I was hesitant to get involved with him after being with someone for so long, but I fell in love with George before I could stop myself. It was easy to because of how great he is. We'd been dating for 4 years when he finally proposed to me after a weekend away visiting his family up north. It was freezing, but he'd knelt down in the snow, with his nose glowing red from the cold, and told me how much he loved me before asking me to marry him. I said yes before he could finish, and my smile was the widest it had ever been when he slid the ring onto my numb finger. We rushed back to the cabin to tell everyone the good news, and it was an amazing night since I love spending time with his family. We decided to have an engagement dinner to celebrate and announce to our extended family. I was left in charge of the planning since I'm more in tune with that kind of stuff, and it was in the process of planning that the idea struck me. I truly had no malicious intent when I planned it. Since I'd already told George everything about my relationship with Michael and how hard it was to get over him, I didn't think he would mind. I'd even hoped he'd find it funny, but I couldn't have been more wrong about everything. While planning the dinner, I came up with the idea for a harmless prank. George is a very analytical person, and he's very passive, a bit stoic. It's just that not much phases him or gets a rise out of him, and I wanted to see if this prank could. I thought it would be funny if I could invite Michael over for the dinner and have him pretend like he'd heard about the engagement and had come to crash the dinner and win me back. It was kind of a way for me to kill two birds with one stone. Get a rise out of George and catch up with Michael since I hadn't seen him in a while. The last I'd heard of him, he was in a happy relationship, and my relationship with George was better than ever. Plus, Michael wasn't just my ex. He was a good friend, and George understood that, so I really didn't think the prank would hurt anyone. I got in touch with Michael. It turned out that he had even been planning to reach out to me too, because he'd heard of my engagement, and explained everything to him. He wasn't against the idea, because like me, he also thought it was funny and harmless, but he was a bit uncomfortable since he'd never actually met George before and agreed to do the prank on the condition that we meet secretly, so that George wouldn't suspect a thing, and also because he wanted his first time meeting him to be after the prank. We would meet at his apartment to plan out the details of the prank. He'd broken up with the girl that he'd been dating a while back, so we had the place to ourselves. I realize now that I should have never agreed to have meetings at his apartment and that I should have left after I found out that he was now single. But like I said before, whenever we were around each other, things just seemed different, like no time had passed, like we were 15 and in love again. I'd fallen in love with George because he was so different from Michael. But then the more time we spent together, the more I started to see why I'd been in love with Michael for so long. He had an arrogance to him that had developed because of his talent and years of praise for it, and it made him so sure of himself and what he wanted. The way he spoke and the way he carried himself was just so confident and alluring, and I found myself getting drawn into him again. George was kind of timid in comparison. He stuck to corners and didn't like to draw attention to himself. He was ambitious when it came to work and his job, but that was about where all his ambition and passion ended. But Michael, he made his presence known whenever he walked into the room. He was big and intense, and his energy was just so infectious. And being close to him started to remind me of what things had been like between us sexually. George wasn't bad in bed by any means. He was sweet and attentive, but he was just kind of apathetic sometimes during it, like he'd rather be going over software updates than sleep me or something. Michael, on the other hand, was completely different. Every time we got close, I remembered how wild and eager he would be whenever we were in bed, and I started to crave that again. I don't want to excuse what I did because there is no excuse, but I don't know. I guess I just wanted more passion. I wanted that from George. It was why I'd set up the prank in the first place. But the more I was around Michael, the more I felt the feelings for him that I'd thought I'd buried start to creep up. And I started to feel like I could get the intensity that I wanted from him instead. I really couldn't help it. He was my first love, my first everything. One night, in the middle of planning, we got way too close and I kissed him. One thing led to another and we ended up having sex. I knew I'd made a horrible mistake the second it was over, and I felt so guilty that it almost made me feel sick. I know now that I should have just stopped seeing him after that, deleted his number, canceled the prank, and just pretended like nothing had ever happened, but instead I convinced myself that it was just a one-time thing and that it had only happened because of the deep history between us. Our breakup had been kind of abrupt, and it wasn't like it had been a decision we both agreed on. It was all because he had started liking someone else. So, in a way, this was closure, a definitive end to almost a decade of our romance. These were the things I told myself, so I could ignore my guilt and continue with the prank plan. The night of the dinner, Michael sent me a bunch of texts asking if I still wanted to go through with it, and if we were going to talk about what happened, which I responded with yes and no. In my head, what I was thinking at the time was calling off the prank would be a kind of admission of guilt. It would be a way of admitting to myself that I'd done something wrong, and I didn't want that. I just wanted to forget about all of it. It was something that had happened between me and someone who I shared such deep history and connection with, a fleeting moment that I'd indulged in with someone I used to love. It was in the past, It didn't have to ruin my future, the life I was going to build with George. The prank went forward as planned, and in front of all our family and friends. I watched as Michael burst into the room and proclaimed his love for me, dramatic and horribly acted, like we'd planned and acted out, but then his tone changed afterwards. He watched my face while I watched George's as he went on and on about how I was the love of his life, how breaking up was a mistake and the worst thing that had ever happened to him, and how he would do anything to get me back. He finished off by begging me not to get married to George and instead be with him, and by the end of all of it, I felt my heart beating fast, because it didn't sound like he was acting at all. It sounded like he was dead serious about still being in love and wanting us back together. And after the night we'd shared, I didn't know what to think. Michael had sucked the air out of the room with his words, and I felt everyone staring me down, waiting for some sort of explanation. So I started laughing, trying to play it off as a joke, which it was originally supposed to be, but had now deviated into something else entirely, and everyone else seemed to catch on and follow my lead, laughing too, when they realized that the whole thing was just a prank and some sort of joke. Everyone was laughing except for the one person that I desperately wanted to laugh. George sat still and stared at me with a frown. It was clear that he did not find any of it funny. I rushed to try and fix things by sending Michael out after assuring everyone that it was all just a joke, but Michael didn't leave easily or quickly. He held on to me outside the house and told me that everything he'd said was true, and that he was sorry it took him so long and me getting engaged for him to understand that there would never be anyone else, and that I was the woman he wanted to be with. I couldn't believe what was happening, that my stupid prank had turned into this. I explained to him that I was in love with George, that I wasn't leaving him, and that I was sure what had happened between us was a mistake, one I didn't want to repeat. And it was true. I'd gotten caught up in my history with Michael, and it caused me to do something regrettable, but that didn't mean I didn't love George. Knowing that it would probably be the last time I ever saw him, and that this would end whatever was left of our relationship for good, I forced him to leave. I'd been outside for too long anyway. I was sure people were started to get suspicious by my absence after the prank had gone a bit sideways. I rushed back to the dinner, and luckily everyone was still all smiles. The only person who wasn't smiling was George. He stared down at his plate with a blank expression, but each time I asked him if he was all right, he said he was fine, and gave me a small smile. I should have known something was off, and that George's need to never make a scene was the only thing keeping the night from blowing up in my face. He was usually a reserved guy, but that night was different. He was completely withdrawn. I had to take on the main role of host and cater to everyone because he was just kind of out of it the whole night. I'd foolishly hoped that the prank had just made him uncomfortable, and that was the reason for his behavior. I'd hoped that that was the end of it. After the party died down and I had shown almost everyone out, I noticed that I couldn't find George in the apartment. I went outside to look for him and found him waiting by his sister's car. He looked tired and upset, like he wanted to be anywhere but there. Thinking he'd just come out to say goodbye, I walked up to him and tried to give him a kiss, but he pulled back. It felt like my heart broke in that moment. George had never done that before. I asked him what was wrong, and he assured me that he was fine and that all the socializing of the night had exhausted him. He explained that he was going to spend the night at his sister's house, and that he'd see me the next day. I was obviously confused. Even if he was overwhelmed, why would he choose to spend the night on his sister's couch instead of in bed with me? It didn't make sense, and the only thing I could think of as a reason was that he was still upset about the prank. I tried to tell him that I was sorry about how things had gone, and that I genuinely misjudged the situation. I thought it would have been funny, and a silly way to test how strongly he felt about me before we announced our engagement, but he just kept saying that it was fine, and that the prank wasn't the problem, that he was just tired and needed to get some sleep. Again, why couldn't he do that with me, in our bed? I told him as much, almost yelling at that point, but he insisted that we would talk the next day and that he needed to go. Thinking the prank had really crossed a line and that he needed some space, I let him go and spent the night thinking of ways I could make it up to him and what exactly I would say to him the next day when we talked, but George didn't come back the next day. At first I assumed that he was still tired. He didn't drink often. He wasn't a fan of the taste of alcohol and hated being inebriated, but he'd had a few drinks at the dinner, so I'd thought maybe he had a hangover, and he'd slept through the morning. With that in mind, I assumed he'd come by in the evening and we'd talk then, but he didn't show up. In my head, I was thinking that he still needed space, so I didn't go over to his sister's house or call. I didn't do anything for 2 whole days, and I had no way of knowing that my inaction would help ruin my relationship. On the 3rd day, he came back, and the first thing he did when he walked into the apartment was not confront me about the prank, but about my night with Michael. I was shocked, completely caught off guard, and confused at how he'd found out about it. He gently told me that not only had he accidentally seen the texts between me and Michael when he was clearing the dining table for the dinner — my phone was amongst the things on it. I'd left it there when I was working on a new story — but he'd followed me and Michael outside after the prank, and he'd watched everything happen between us. He'd hung back at the door and watched as Michael begged me to leave George and get back with him. After reading the texts and watching me with Michael, it was obvious something had happened between us. George explained everything without a hint of anger or any sign that he was upset, and the whole thing made me feel so guilty that I told him the truth. I told him about the night that Michael and I shared, but I tried to make it clear to him that it only happened once and that it would never happen again. George knew about how strong my feelings had been for Michael and how intense our relationship had been. We'd been together since I was a teenager, for goodness sake, so I expected him to understand how those feelings could have been triggered again after we spent time together. George stayed silent as I tried to assure him that me sleeping with Michael was something that really shouldn't affect our relationship. He'd already known about how hard it was for me to move past him. It had been one of the main issues in our own relationship when we first got together. My night with Michael was, in a way, an end to that chapter of my life. I explained to him that now that that had happened with Michael, I was now more sure than ever that he was the one I wanted to marry and spend the rest of my life with. Now that I'd dealt with my past, I was ready to move on to my future with him. Once I was done, I waited for a response. I waited for George to say something, but he just sat there silently staring at his palms. His quietness after all I'd said, all I'd told him, started to irritate me, and I started longing for what I'd wanted out of this prank in the first place, for something to set him off, to get him passionate about something, about me. I expected him to be angry, and to my surprise, I found that I even wanted him to be angry. I wanted him to get livid at the idea that I would even be interested in someone that wasn't him. To be upset that I'd gone behind his back to do all of this. I wanted him to show that any of it affected him at all, because then that would show how much he cared about and wanted me. But he just sat there, and he continued to sit there for minutes on end. I expected rage, but was met with deep, horrible silence. I grabbed his hands, his face, his body, anywhere I could while I begged for his forgiveness, because at first I'd interpreted that silence as anger. But after a while of my pleading and him not saying anything, I realized that it was just nothing. After a while, he gently pulled my hands off of him and walked out. I chased after him, still trying to plead my case, but it was like, to him, I wasn't even there. He continued to march down the hallway like there was no one speaking to him, like our relationship didn't matter or wasn't hanging by a thread. Eventually, I gave up, and I went back to the apartment, and then I cried until I couldn't anymore, until my head hurt and my face was puffy. His silence hurt more than anything else could have. I would have preferred his anger, his disappointment, or even his disgust, but him not even bothering to say anything, not even dignifying me with a response, felt like my world had ended. And the silence continued. I tried reaching out and speaking to him multiple times, but I was met with the same blank stare and his usual apathetic attitude. I even pleaded with my sister and his to try to talk to him, not to paint me as the victim or anything, but to just get him to agree to speak to me, to work things out, but he wouldn't budge. It didn't take long for everyone in the family to find out about everything but even my parents, and his think that our relationship and engagement is too precious and important to be discarded over what happened. They've tried to convince him to understand that too, but he won't change his mind. At least he's even talking to them, while all I have gotten for weeks, is silence. He hasn't called the engagement off. He'd have to speak to me to do that. At first that gave me hope, but now I'm not so sure that it's a good thing. How do I fix a relationship with someone that won't even speak to me? And do I even want to continue being with someone that won't even fight for our relationship? Someone who insists on punishing me with this loud, unending silence? What do?